ending on a little bit of suspense there. That was the first half a minute or so of Brahms's Cello Sonata in F Major, Opus 99. From the opening few seconds, you can tell what an epic, passion-filled work this is. And we're going to, before we perform it for you, tell you a little bit about how he achieves that and also maybe why it means so much to us as well. This is Cats, Chats and 88 Keys. My name's JP.
I'm Luba.
Hey, and this is the first time we've made music together since, well, yeah, there's a little bit of a cyclical feel here because Luba joined me for the very first of our lockdown concerts right back in...
March was Mother's Day.
It's Mother's Day. Of course it was. In fact, it was kind of your idea that we should do this. You and Alex coming over with some very rudimentary gear back then. And yeah, look where we are now. The other nice thing, I guess, is that when we did that concert, we also played the second movement from this sonata.
So it all comes round.
So there's another feeling of cycle, which I think is probably fitting. I gave my first real live concert to actual humans outside the house yesterday, and there is a feeling that things are lifting, although I think the profession as a whole has never been more in the dark still about what the future holds. Luba plays at the Royal Opera House, and I don't know where things are there right now.
Well, neither do we really, so still waiting.
And if an institution as established and financially rich as that is in the darkness, one can only imagine where the grassroots of music in this country is. So I think it's, yeah, if nothing else, it's important we all realise that we've still got a huge fight on our hands, and the future is very uncertain. But it's for us to regale you now with some wonderful music. Brahms composed this in 1886. He was in the habit at that time of holidaying in Switzerland, around Lake Thun. However, if you're expecting the sort of pastoral loveliness that those holidays so often inspired him, I think you would be slightly disappointed with this work. This is vast and epic and heroic, and struggle, I think, is right at the heart of it.
When you say holidaying as well, I think it was more like he got into a pattern of kind of spending the summer somewhere nice to spend it in refuge to compose things, and then in the winter he would then go back to, you know, to the public and perform those works. So that was kind of the pattern.
That's true. Although I think a lot of the works he did compose there did have that kind of pastoral loveliness to them. I'm thinking of the first two violin sonatas, for example.
Yes, I mean, you can really imagine the views of Switzerland if you've ever been to Switzerland. It's just absolutely magnificent. So he did compose this sonata in 1886 in the summer. Then he performed it, I believe, in October. First of all, it was a small performance only for critics and close friends in Berlin, I think. And then 10 days later it was in Vienna for general public.
And I think one of the funniest aspects of this piece is how terribly it was received. People didn't really get it. We can show you some of the techniques he uses that make it slightly strange, but I think the most damning and revealing criticism came from his contemporary composer Hugo Wolf, who said, if this is where harmony, melody, rhythm has got us, then we have just descended into total chaos. And Brahms might be the greatest charlatan of this century and any other. Let's not forget Hugo Wolf was shortly to end up in a mental asylum. Maybe these were the early signs of that madness coming along. I should say we've got some lovely people here with us. Edward's here. I think round your second or third.
I lost count.
Well, let's get your loyalty card punched up. And Chrissy's here, making her debut. It's lovely you're here. And obviously Gabby's here. Very much, and Maestro Bobby Kay handling the tech as supremely as always. So yeah, it's lovely to have you watching, but it's also the vibe of humans in the room is something you can never really trump. That's a dirty word. Okay, how does this piece make us feel? I think right from the beginning, as I think you surely heard, we are in the throes of a storm. The piano writing, he writes these tremolos, which very unusual in Brahms, A, and B, a real sign of the kind of orchestral richness that he was going for. Composers tended to only use tremolos when they were either directly trying to create the sound of a string section in orchestra, or even directly when they were arranging an orchestral piece for piano, that's how they would use them. So all this kind of writing, wrong pedal, sort of very indistinct, but you can hear the foam and the rushing waters. And
which then, of course, I have later in the album.
And that is super progressive. So, I mean, it was fairly unusual to put those kinds of writing in the piano, but when he transfers them to the cello, it's very, very unusual, and it comes right in the most kind of unsettled section in the development. And I think that's a real, that's maybe a clue as to what Wolf was talking about. There were these sounds coming out of the performers that people had really not heard before. If we play a bit more of that section where you have the tremolos, maybe we can play from 94. The piano has these very kind of slow-moving harmonic pillars of sound, quietly over the top of these rustlings and whisperings. And what's also interesting, as you can hear, is that it's not free-form fast notes. There's a pulse inside them. And I think that's probably one of the hallmarks of this work as well, is that even if it, in its slowest sections, the beginning of the second movement, for example, there's always this thread pulling us forwards. The architecture is never beholden to the beauty of the melody. And in fact, I think that's in one way that Brahms was a serious progressive, is that the writing is not tuneful for tune's sake. There's very few tunes in this piece that you're going to go away lulling down the pub. It's not like that. The music is created out of gesture, out of elements, often very short, sharp ideas, and then they are developed and layered to produce these vast works. Beethoven was the one who really started this, and Brahms very much followed in his footsteps. So we don't get the feeling that we are just passively listening to pretty tunes. We get the feeling that we are being directly confronted and immersed by and in layers of ideas. And I think it's very powerful. So the beginning, if we play that for you again, the cello has these dotted rhythms, but they're just isolated intervals, some rising, therefore striving or questioning, and some falling, therefore releasing or sighing. But it's certainly nothing you would go away thinking, wow, what a great melodist Brahms is. And what's incredible is that each of those little ideas incorporates a different interval. Now, some bigger, some smaller. And so much of what comes in the music following that in the first movement is based on those ideas. But it's so imperceptible with Brahms because he's changed the texture and the rhythm and the dynamics so much that you actually don't know that's what he's doing. Certainly on first listening, and even speaking for myself, it's only by actively digging into the score and studying that you actually can see the logic and the genius behind the music. And I think that's also what's so incredible, is that the form of this music is one of its most important characteristics. Its structure, the logic, the cohesion, the way it's put together. But as an audience member, you're never directly aware of that. It doesn't shout that genius in your face, which if it did would be quite tedious. And so it's got this incredible feeling that you're being carried along. I think more than any other composer, possibly it's very hard to tell where specific sections start and finish, because the music is constantly dovetailing. And one idea that's going to be important in the next section is subtly introduced in the previous section as a side thought, and then seized upon and becomes the most important material later. I think the central idea of the first movement is struggle. We begin with these heroic leaps. The piano second subject speaks of a certain triumph over adversity. And then the cello echoes. We have a real feeling that we might have won the battle there. But I think it's the development section in the first movement that gives us the most amount of unrest. Again, the music doesn't have a theme, and it kind of disintegrates and moves into this kind of murky, slaloming, wending and winding texture.
Full of semitones as well.
Full of semitones,
yeah.
which have been referenced before, but super subtly. And so, but now suddenly they become the main thing. Maybe we can play from 74.
Mm-hmm.
Also, definitely weird sounds, the likes of which people at the time would have had their heads a little bit blown by. In fact, this whole development section, the development section is the section that happens after the composer has kind of shown you his wares, after he's kind of stated the most important ideas. He then goes to development section where he explores those ideas. And the whole of this development section is pretty mad, because it starts with that and then it moves on to your groaning and grumblings.
And you can see why it was so shocking, because you started the sonata with such an extraordinary bold statement, and then whilst you're trying to get your head around it, you go into this development section, which is completely different, haunted kind of thing with lots of semitones and the weird effects, which that's really unusual at that time to write.
Totally. But then again, when the opening material then returns, that makes it feel even more like we might have got somewhere. And we end the first movement feeling that, things could definitely be worse. And from here, he shifts us into a totally different universe. So the piece is in F major, has only one black note in it. From there, he moves up a semitone, so very close interval on the piano, F major chord. He then moves up to an F sharp major chord, which has 5 black notes and feels as far away from F major as you could pretty much wish to go. And he transports us into this unbelievable world. The other very, very amazing aspect of this is the writing in the cello. So the piano has, we were actually talking earlier about who has the tune at the beginning of the second movement, and Luba quite rightly said, well, actually that's not the point. We both have beautiful things that are lovely on their own, but when we put them together they become something more incredible. But I would say that the pizzicato writings, that's when the cello plucks the strings, the pizzicato writing that you have at the beginning of here is one of the most heart-melting things I've ever heard. And this really is some of the most tender, loving music that I've ever come across. My mum's favourite composer is Brahms, and I always feel in this movement that this is right up her street, really speaks to her soul. In fact, I think when we played this for Mother's Day, we dedicated this movement to her, because I think it was her birthday.
It was, yeah.
On the same day, which was a bit mad. Now look, Brahms is not a sentimental man. So, you know, the fact that this movement starts beautifully is no sign, is no indication that there won't be trouble. And there will. And actually it comes kind of out of nowhere. The piano spins this beautiful lullaby, which then fades away to nothing. And then after, suddenly, the cello comes to the party and changes the mood entirely. And we move into the minor, things are much darker, and if you listen to what the piano was doing, it was one of Brahms's many rhythmic ploys deliberately designed to unsettle things. So where the beat is here, and the cello's playing a perfectly lovely, if dark, melody within that, the piano's going and playing on all the offbeats, so as to create this lack of stability.
Yeah. It's worth noting that it is said this movement originated actually as a different thing, that Brahms wrote for his first cello sonata in E minor, a movement which he later discarded, and which later actually became a material for this. And you can kind of hear this subject if you listen to this. And then if you remember the beginning of E minor, of course. So you've got the same
shape, and with the piano offbeat accompaniment creating the unsettlement.
So there's a very strong link between those two.
Nice. The way in which he brings back the opening material of the second movement is truly shocking, but I'm going to leave that for you to experience firsthand. In the third movement, I think we should talk about his rhythmic games.
Yes, I think it's also a nice link with that this again. It's the same key as the third movement, so it's a kind of a nice link to go into the scherzo.
And in the scherzo, Brahms does what he does probably better and more characteristically than anyone. He plays ridiculous tricks with the meter. So we're ostensibly in 2 beats in a bar. Da 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 dee da da dee da da dee da dum. Each of those beats is split into 3, so we have 6 notes in a bar. And of course, with a group of 6, you can split them into 2 groups of 3, as he does most normally, but you can also split them into 3 groups of 2. And what he does with great effect here is plays both of those at the same time, so that they're working directly against each other. So, for example, we're going to play the beginning. Amidst this chaos and this turmoil, heroism does try to emerge, right? Maybe if we play the theme from 11, he tries to rise above the chaos and give us some semblance of hope. But it doesn't last long before we're immediately plunged back into this slalom idea. In fact, funnily, it was while having quite a few beers with a friend about a year ago that we stuck on this movement at about 2 in the morning. My friend's not he's not a musician, let's say, and just drunkenly going through how funky and edgy the rhythmic play was in here was one of the reasons why he said, "Oh my God, you should find a way of talking like this to a wider audience, because this is very, very, very cool music." The central section, so the third movement is what we call a scherzo. Normally before Brahms it would have been quite a light, scherzo literally means joke. It was quite a light way in a 4-movement work of breaking the tension, of creating some levity before the more intense last movement. Brahms marks this allegro passionato, which is an unusual word to have as an opening indication, passionate. And actually I think that possibly the most stormy and unsettled music in this movement. Structurally, a scherzo has 2 faster outer sections and a more reflective inner section. But again, in the inner section, he's not letting us rest that much, because you're trying to do a lovely tune with 2 in a bar, ta da dee dum, and the piano's in 3 in a bar, ba 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 ba. So even then, we're not entirely in agreement. To the fore even more, I would say, at 160, where again you're operating with a very peaceful, simple idea, and I'm consistently throwing spanners into the works. And then I think what often gives people trouble with Brahms is how light the last movement is. So this is a huge work, 25, 26, 27 minutes, something like that. 4 movements, which was not particularly typical. His other cello sonata is 3 movements. 2 of his 3 violin sonatas are 3 movements. But 4 movements is a real statement of intent from a composer. It means we're going symphonic on this. This is not chamber music. These are not 2 individuals. We're mustering larger forces. And so you would expect, after a work of this scale, the last movement to be pretty Herculean. But what he does here, as he does so often before, is start with a kind of lovely little ditty.
It's like a music box melody. It's very simple. I mean, this movement is the shortest out of all 4, and it opens up with this really simple melody. That's the only probably one melody you come away with, you know, singing stuck in your head.
Absolutely right, and it makes me think of someone strolling through the fields just whistling a little tune to himself. It's so kind of carefree, it's very 4 square, none of these rhythmic games are being played, we know exactly where we are. But as I think is the theme of every one of these movements, they pit 2 incredibly different musical ideas and emotions against each other. And just so as when we think that things are not going to be so bad, he plunges us into an incredibly stormy and passionate central section. Maybe I'll just play you from like 55, so we can feel the transition from one to the other. Back at it again. Luba's trying to play something quite normal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and the piano's going and creating that stability, instability, and that turbulence. What I love about Brahms is that he manages to muster so much chaos out of order. This isn't random music. He's unbelievably gifted as a composer in terms of understanding the technique of his craft and the way music is organised, and he's assimilated form and structure to a T, and then from that he's just pulling out the Jenga blocks all over the place as he can to just destabilise things, but never to a point where he's not in control of the situation. The music just feels like it might not be in control of the situation.
But you say he uses every possible things. For example, in the cello part you have this accented offbeats completely, so go... But the bit is actually 1 bit later, so that's also contained this.
That's great, yeah, he does what we call displaced bar lines. So bar lines give us structure in our music. They tell us where the first beat of the bar is, and the first beat of the bar is normally the one that, well, a conductor gives it a downbeat. So that gives us verticality, that gives us order. What Brahms does is he spins long phrases where he makes us think that the downbeat is somewhere else in the bar. And we buy that, that's fine. But then suddenly we realise it's not, and it feels like we've had too many downbeats in too quick succession, and that makes us feel discombobulated somewhat. The opening material comes back wonderfully. There's a small bit of respite. I think it's very cute what he does at 129. Just as a little kind of doffing of the cap to the second movement, he brings back pizzicato one last time, but playing the melody from the last movement. We'll go straight on there with the upbeats. That is your music box. Yes. I mean, that sounds exactly like that incredible sound world. God knows if Wolf and the audiences even thought that was totally unacceptable. And then after a small lull, we roar through to the finish. Brahms was pretty much in the last throes of his compositional career. I mean, he was to live for another 10 years, but his output in that time was not large. In fact, he basically stopped composing in about 6 years' time, and then only returned at the very end once he discovered the wonders of the clarinet, and suddenly composed his clarinet trio and 2 clarinet sonatas. But after this, in terms of epic, large-scale works, there's the 3rd violin sonata, there's the string quintet, there's the double concerto, but there's not a lot, and I would therefore, there's a larger point to be made really, I think. When you set this aside, his first cello sonata, which is very early, opus 38, it's an incredible dichotomy, because his Opus 38 is a very serious, studied, intellectual, mature work. It sounds like the wise old man looking back on life. But it's a very youthful work in terms of his age. And this work, which is the music of an old man, is written with this sweep of youthful passion. And I feel like this music actually is pretty much a swan song. I mean, after this, the vast majority of the works he was to write, for example, all of the late piano opuses, are deeply reflective and autumnal, as we so often refer to Brahms as. Low in energy, deep on introspection and philosophy. But this is not. This is red-blooded and pedal to the metal.
Yes, and I guess it's worth also mentioning that he couldn't have written it without having a person he was writing for in his mind, and that was Robert Hausmann, who was the cellist of the Joachim Quartet at that time, who was absolutely incredible cellist, who played this work with Brahms quite a few times, and for whom Brahms then wrote